Welcome again to Minds Between Languages. Joining us today is Professor Maureen Ehrensberger-Dow, who specializes, among other things, in the study of cognitive load and the ergonomics of translation and interpreting. These are the two topics addressed in the present episode. Well, welcome to another episode of Minds Between Languages. It is my pleasure to have here Maureen. There's no point in using last names when we've actually been together and interacted in the past. So it's great to have you here, Maureen, and we can't wait to hear what you have to tell us about cognitive load and ergonomics. So thank you very much for accepting this invitation.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an interesting format that I've never participated in before.
Great.
I'm in Switzerland, you're in Argentina.
Yeah, I know. It's one of the wonders of technology, right? And you tell us a little bit more about other wonders of technology as we progress. But before we delve into that part of the interview, let's start with the general question I'd like to address today. What is cognitive load, Maureen?
Oh, you're starting with the easiest question. Not. Cognitive load was a concept that might have been around before a fellow by the name of John Sweller introduced it. That was back in 1988 in educational psychology. And it was basically to try to explain learning, how people learned or had trouble learning. And it had to do with learning mathematical equations. So it's far away from translation and interpreting. But the idea of load when you're doing something that it loads your cognitive resources is very appealing. And
Right.
so it's been taken up in our field.
Okay, so it's been taken up, and I assume that the way in which cognitive load manifests in translation and interpreting must have some peculiarities, right? What can you tell us about this?
Well, going back to Sweller's definition, he distinguished between two types of load, and one was he called intrinsic load, and it's still called that. They've just published a special issue actually in 2019, Educational Psychology Review on cognitive load theory. So it's still very much an important theory in the field of educational psychology, and they still talk about intrinsic load and what they call extraneous load. And intrinsic load is related to the task at hand. So it's how hard it is to do something, basically. And extraneous load is all that other stuff that kind of gets in the way when you're trying to do something. So that's the idea of extraneous. So in translation, you could imagine that the source text is the intrinsic load, and the task of putting that source text content into the right form in the target language appropriate to your target audience, meeting your client's needs, that's the intrinsic load.
Okay.
But then extraneous load is all the stuff that isn't helpful that gets in the way. So if you're using a computer and suddenly your internet connection goes,
right,
and you can't research a term, or you can't find a term. You're looking to try to understand something in the source text, and you just can't work out what the person is saying, and you don't recognize the word, and you can't find a resource, and then you realize, aha, it was misspelled.
Right.
So those kinds of things can be called extraneous load.
So basically, there's a combination of, let's say, internal and external factors that coalesce, that come together to cumulatively shape and determine the amount of load in the task. Would that be a correct interpretation?
Yeah, you can think of it that way. We've talked to lots of translators and interpreters, and you might have had this experience yourself and people in the audience as well. When you're translating something, you're interpreting, you can get into the flow. It feels right. It's almost like you're in the text and it's just all coming together. Or you can have a text where it just doesn't work. It's hard work, and you can think of that as sort of higher load. And when you're in the flow, you have load, but it's all working together. The extraneous things, the extraneous factors are not blocking you.
Right. Now, this applies to translation. When we're saying translation here, even though we're not making this explicit, we are thinking about written translation, right? I mean, going from a written text to another written text. But
Right.
Of course, there are other modalities of, let's say, interlingual reformulation, if you want to call it that. Interpreting, let's say simultaneous interpreting, just to give it a more specific orientation, is a case in question. Now, I take it that both types of load must be different in interpreting, simultaneous interpreting. Would that be right, Maureen?
Well, the intrinsic load, you could argue, is very similar in that you're having to process a text in another language and then transfer it in the right form to another language. So you could argue that's the same. However, the simultaneous interpreting is more linear, whereas a translator is reading and sometimes producing almost at the same time, but has the chance of going back over things. So it's a different kind of load, definitely. And in interpreting, scholars have been talking about this longer, actually, than the translation scholars. So there are a couple of well-known scholars who've talked about the different kinds of load, this listening and analysis, and the load on short-term memory where you have to retain it, whereas in translation, it's out there on the paper. You don't have to hang on to it in the same way. You have to hang on to solutions that you're considering, but you don't have to hang on to the source text. You have to produce it, and you've got to coordinate all that. So you could argue the components might be different, yes.
Right. What is perhaps surprising to me is this idea that, let's say, the source text specific load might be so similar between both modalities, right? One would think that when you're dealing with oral speech, as is the case in simultaneous interpreting for most part at least, you have texts with different, let's say, textual properties, right? I mean, there are hesitations, there are on-the-fly corrections, there are even improvised things that may, go beyond the topic at hand. So I wonder if these things actually amount to a difference in that, let's say, internal type of flow you were describing first.
I think what we've got in translation, because it does have the possibility of going over it. The expectation is higher that the final product is going to be perfect, or as close to perfect as it possibly can be. So if something is ambiguous in the source text, it's the job of the translator to work it out. If something's ambiguous in the speech, the simultaneous interpreter does the best she or he can within that limited space of time, but then has to let it go and maybe correct later if they realize, oops, that wasn't wrong, what was wrong. What the translator has to do, they might get it wrong too, and then they have to go back over the whole text and rework to make sure the whole thing works again.
Right.
So there are similarities, and that I would argue that the complexity of the language in most written texts is different from the complexity of language in spoken texts. Spoken modality tends to be lower level of English, sorry, in my case of English, with repetitions that are okay, the hesitations, the pauses, saying things in a different way, whereas things tend to be more compact in written texts.
Right.
And
But
they're
that's
harder to process.
Right, because I mean textually and contextually, if you will, I mean the expectations and the standards by which one judges the quality of a written text and let's say spontaneous speech of oral presentation, right? I mean, they're different. So
Absolutely.
okay, now another thing that's interesting here is that we are talking about these things, and for a newcomer to the field, I mean, I would say, okay, so I get it, but basically all of this is based on introspection. Let's say how someone feels, and or the anecdotes that are shared among practitioners, or perhaps just third-party descriptions of what's going on. But surely there are more scientific ways of measuring cognitive load in both translation and interpreting. Could you tell us a little bit about that way of approaching the problem?
So some people would argue that what you just described is also scientific.
Some people would, indeed. And perhaps I would myself. But let's talk a little bit about the more experimental lab-based work that you are also an expert in.
Okay, I don't know about an expert, but I'm involved in a large project on cognitive load in interpreting and translation. And indeed, we're trying to combine these various techniques because a lot of the research, you're quite right, up to now has been based on anecdotal reports or on interview or self-report. And that's all very valuable, but we would like to be able to try to measure the differences in cognitive load if possible. One could argue you can't measure cognitive load at all What you can do is assume there's a certain load, and then you could measure the effort that seems to be associated with processing, with doing that task. And that's what we're trying to get at, is the effort. And you can do that in translation by speed. I mean, how fast can someone translate a text? Level of accuracy, how fluent it sounds. You can measure it with number of errors, how many times people have to go back to revise. So there are lots of different ways one can, in the translation process, have measures of effort associated with processing a certain text. There are also techniques such as eye tracking and pupillometry, that you can measure the intensity of the gaze. You can measure how often people's gaze has to go back and forwards, regressions and things. There's even in the neuropsychology part of our project, which I'm not responsible for, the possibility of using EEG, so recording brain patterns, heart rate, galvanic skin response, which is an indication of stress. If someone gets very stressed, they might sweat, and then that's detectable. So there are lots of ways to do this.
What is interesting here is that then load seems to be a very multi-determined notion, let's say. It's something that is very complex, that has many different facets, if you will. And by what you're telling me, it seems to actually cut across the whole of our organism. I mean, you were mentioning measures that can be derived from the speed of your performance, ocular patterns, your let's say your skin conductance, right? Your brain patterns. So all across our eyes, brains, hands, our behavior in general, you can track. You can find little traces of load. Would that be an accurate depiction of it?
Absolutely. What we're exploring right now is something called the face reader, and how accurate a face reader can detect emotions, because we would argue that that's also associated with cognitive load. If someone gets frustrated or surprised or can't figure something else, we tend to use our faces subconsciously, unconsciously, to depict that. And we also, both of us, have been using our hands. I've seen both of our fingers appearing in the screen. We're brains within bodies. There are very few people who are so trapped, whose bodies are so trapped that they can't move. And those of us who can move, we tend to think with the whole body.
And it's something that I really find valuable in the way you are framing the problem, is that cognitive load does not seem to be something separate from stress or emotion. On the contrary, you seem to have this integrative view of it, which actually aligns quite well with many contemporary views of cognition that deviate from this old assumption that the mind is something and cognitive processes are separate from, even distinguishable, and categorically different from your emotional processes or your stress or even your bodily dynamics. That seems to be part of one of the let's say fortunate and felicitous events that we've had in the field in the last decades. And another thing that's interesting is it is one thing to learn how to best describe a phenomenon, how to understand and define, if you will, load. But are there practical implications that can be derived from your studies, Maureen? Can we teach or provide suggestions for trainees or professionals on how to reduce their load?
Well, reducing load isn't completely desirable, because if load is reduced too much, it's boring. And translators that we've talked to are not interested in translating boring texts. Machines can do that. So there has to be a certain amount of load. It's when the load is too much, then it becomes very relevant, what you're saying, reducing load. One thing we're exploring in our project is whether gesturing can offload. Whether when people are getting overloaded, if they use gestures to try to offload whatever it is, the tension that's being built up, or free up capacity. We're not understanding exactly what's going on, but we've seen that some people seem to be using gestures in that way. And if we can find out a bit more about that, that will be helpful. Improving source text quality would reduce load significantly. And I don't know about you, but most practicing translators, and myself included, that's one of the biggest problems, is the source text quality. So maybe an easy way to reduce load during translation is to pre-edit a text.
Mhm.
to kind of tidy up the text, or get the client or somebody in between to tidy up the text, check it for consistency and whatnot. If working conditions are good, if people don't have a lot of extraneous load because they're trying to suppress noise in the background, they're trying to ignore the ringing of the telephone, it's too hot and they're feeling uncomfortable, all of those things can be helpful. So getting people to become aware of that is what's important when you go back to training. If they realize that all these things are affecting them, if their body is unhappy, their brain is not going to be working as well as they would like it to.
Right, right. That's very, very clear. And I was going back in my mind to this idea that we are embodied agents, basically, right? And this
Mhm.
is, of course, just as relevant for translation and interpreting as it is for any other field of life, let's say, right? Now, in the case of
Indeed.
translation and interpreting, these bodies, these complex bodies that we are in contact with a lot of technological devices. And I mean technology in a broad sense. I mean chairs, desks, computers,
Hmm.
hearing aids or earplugs or whatever it is that the task may require. Um,
Headphones.
Headphones in your case, definitely. But what is the role of all of this, and is there a particular subfield within translation and interpreting studies that addresses these matters?
I don't know if it's a subfield, but certainly this whole idea of 4E cognition has been picked up in translation studies. That we are our bodies, we are our minds. So there's something that's calling itself cognitive translatology. I don't know whether that name will stick or not. We came at it from a different angle. Our study group started looking at the ergonomics of translation, because ergonomics is a field that has existed for a long time. People have an idea of what ergonomics is, and it's accessible. When you say you're interested in the ergonomics of translation, people can imagine what that's all about. And we've had a lot of cooperation by practicing translators in our research, because they worry about the ergonomics of their workplace as well, and they want to know more about it. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but
Definitely, and for those of us who are a little bit perhaps short-minded to make a good guess at what ergonomics is, could you tell us a little bit about the goal, the scope, and how the field is actually intersecting with translation and interpreting studies?
sure, I'd be happy to. Actually, the interpreters were ahead of us on this one.
Right.
In 2002, there was a study published by IKE, which is an international organization of interpreting, called the Workload Study. And I read about that study back in 2002, and it really resonated with me, because they were worried about conditions in the booth. So interpreters who were getting overheated, who didn't have enough oxygen, who were suffering from stress. The content of what they were interpreting might have been so stressful, and they had no way to sort of get rid of that stress. And so they were onto this much earlier, and they developed lots of standards of how technology should be used in interpreting situations. And the technology in translation has been important. I remember, I'm giving away my age, when computers were used for the first time in translation. And the debate was, oh, you can't do a translation on the computer. You can only write out your translation. You might be able to type it into one of those fancy new things afterwards, but you can only translate with pen and paper. Now, I've always used computers for my translation work, but I was a bit of an exception when I started. And then there were the CAT tools, and that was horrible for us as well. But there wasn't an investigation of, were these tools designed in a helpful way for us? There was just a resistance to the tools, and that has actually continued. Only now are people starting to realize, okay, these tools, this technology is here to stay. So how do we deal with it?
Right.
And I think that by looking at it from an ergonomics perspective, you get a broader perspective. You mentioned tools and technology in terms of desks and whatnot, and that's covered by the International Ergonomics Association under physical ergonomics.
Right.
They also talk about environmental ergonomics, which is air temperature. I mean, that's really important.
Right.
If there's a draft, if you're feeling uncomfortable, if the quality of the air is poor, if you're stuck in this little, some people are working in cupboards right now because they have no other place to work. This
Right.
is not healthy, right? There's also the cognitive ergonomics, which has to do basically with human-computer interaction. So when you're making decisions and the tools that you're using, are they helping you with that decision making or are they hindering you? That's
Hmm.
cognitive ergonomics. So is an interface usable? Can you use a tool when you first buy a new program? Is it easy to get into? Is it hard? Is it counterintuitive? And then there's also organizational ergonomics, which has to do with the person. It's always about the person. Ergonomics is about it's the science of work, if you like, but the person is in the center. So in our case, the translator is in the center. So is the translator at the very end of the value chain? Are they
Right.
not being consulted? Are they getting some rotten source text at the very end and they're supposed to turn it into this lovely target text? They don't know what the corporate goals are. They're just being thrown this text as though they can magically understand all of the hidden meaning and get it right. And they often do. They're amazing. But if translators are closer to the center of an organization and they understand the goals, they're going to be producing better text,
Right.
obviously, because they'll understand what it's all about.
Right.
So it's all those aspects that are part of ergonomics.
What is perhaps curious, whenever you have a classification system, I mean, you made a distinction among physical ergonomics and environmental ergonomics and cognitive ergonomics.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes, the labels that we use in our classification systems may be a little bit tricky or perhaps misleading.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, following from what you were telling me earlier in the interview, there is no hardcore distinction between our mental processes or emotional processes and our bodily dynamics. Therefore, uh, surely some aspects of the physical ergonomics, some aspects of the environmental ergonomics must impinge on our cognitive processes. I mean our attention, our load itself, perhaps, or working memory capacity, or your inhibition, or what have you, right?
Exactly.
Is this the case, Maureen? I mean, is there I don't know if a direct link, but some sort of connection between the physical and environmental disposition of where we are, what we are doing, and how our, let's say, cold cognitive processes are deployed?
Mm-hmm. This is why working with translators is so lovely, because when they're working on screen and we're taking screen recordings, which we do, and if we're videotaping them at the same time, we can see what they're doing physically and what's happening on the screen. And we had a lovely case study of a translator who had told us she was going to be stopping work at 12 to have her lunch break. And at 11:30, she'd been working with great concentration, just reaching over to take a drink of water every so often, otherwise absolute concentration. At 11:30, she started shifting in her chair. She started kind of shifting her shoulders. She had decided she was going to finish at 12 just because she decided that, but her body was telling her this is not a good idea. And when we examined her work, she made more errors. She was making more typing mistakes. There were more regressions. She was having to back up, recheck things. Yeah, clearly, we are who we are.
That is wonderful, and it's one of those a gap, or perhaps one of those challenges, of those frontiers. I mean, theoretically, in terms of our definitions and our epistemological convictions, or of many of us in the field, yeah, we are quite at ease with the idea that we are embodied entities, and that there are no hardcore divisions between our brain or our cold cognitive processes or emotion and so on and so forth. But then when it comes to actually finding ways of connecting, of linking all the dots, in an experimental design, or even in a model that may be just descriptive or applied, we're not quite there yet. That is my impression. Do you share this, or do you have a more optimistic view than I do?
No, I share it. And this is, you asked about all these the categories. I find the categories useful partly because they mean something to people. People can imagine something. When I talk about physical ergonomics or environmental ergonomics, they can link it to their own experience, and that makes sense to them. If I talk about this muddle of stuff, factors that interact, it gets very, very messy. And then it's much more difficult. People just say, oh yeah, it's hard. But if you can pull it apart a bit, tease it apart a bit, then you can actually make change as well.
Right.
Then you can improve conditions in certain ends. Not everything, but you can try to improve conditions for people so that they can do their job better.
Absolutely, absolutely. But now it just comes to my mind that you also have a training background in psychology. You are, correct me if I'm wrong here, Maureen, but you are a psychologist, right? And you earned a degree in psychology before.
That's accurate. Yes.
Okay, that's more like it. Okay, okay. Now this is interesting. I mean, not many people working in translation and interpreting studies have this training, have this background. I was wondering, what is your take, your experience? What has this provided you with? How has this, let's say, played a role in the way in which you frame and you approach the theoretical and methodological and applied problems of translation and interpreting?
Well, my first degree was a 4-year BA honors degree, and that indeed was in psychology, although I actually started in natural sciences. So I had a lot of math and physics and biology and things, but I got more and more interested in people and what people did, and psychology was a way of getting at that. And I think that that training of experimentation, of rigor, of control, of design, gave me experience with different kinds of methods as well, and a different way of thinking about trying to get at behavior and measuring behavior. My master's degree was in psycholinguistics, and it was also very experimentally based, and my PhD was in experimental linguistics as well. So I came at this whole field very much from trying to understand what's going on in the mind. And I didn't come at it from what are translated texts like, which I think a lot of people come at it. So I was not a text person at all, and embarrassingly, I didn't have a huge repertoire of languages at my disposal, but certainly a orientation to the process, an orientation to the people involved, and an orientation to the cognitive dimension. And you said I was a psychologist. I wouldn't say I was. I'm not sure what I am. So switching disciplines has happened a lot in my life. And I ended up in translation studies. I feel very comfortable here. But yes, I think that has also helped in a way, in that I wasn't afraid of trying to get into the perspective of another discipline. So most of my research has also been interdisciplinary work.
Right, right. And I take it there must have been challenges for you as well. I mean, because you did not, in your training, you did not share the ethos and the readings, perhaps, and the overall rationale that, let's say, the community, that the already existing and evolving community of cognitive translation and interpreting studies had developed, right? I mean, so I wonder, was this a struggle for you, or did you find it easy to accommodate your mindset with how the field was operating at the time in which you first became involved with it?
Yeah, I was very fortunate in that I hooked up with a writing process researcher at my own institution, and he happened to know some people in the applied linguistics field, Rita Jeskeleinen, Susanna Gupfrich at the time, who were involved in translation process research. And that's how I got in. I got in through the back door. And it just happened that translation process research was going in a direction that I felt completely comfortable with. And they were a very welcoming community. So I was lucky. I think if it had been 10 years before that, it would have been much harder.
To wrap things up here, as a non-psychologist with a degree in psychology and an interest in the human mind and how people interact, and decades of work and expertise, let me use that word, please, in translation and interpreting, let me change the approach here. But what would you say translation and interpreting as complex human activities have taught us about the human mind at large?
Well, one could argue that language is a window onto the mind, and activities that involve switching between languages has shaken up our ideas about brain architecture. This assumption of the monolingual and one system lexis, of one list of vocabulary items. That's impossible to maintain with the kinds of behaviors and the kinds of activities that translators and interpreters engage in every day. So brain architecture, plasticity, the notions of conceptual transfer, that you can see the world from a different perspective. These sorts of things, I think, are what translation and interpreting studies can offer to the world, and I think we are offering to the world.
Fantastic. And just one more question. What do you think the field will offer to the world in upcoming decades? I mean, 2020, let's play a little bit of a futurology game here. What do you think will be the, I don't know if the breakthroughs, but at least, the next frontiers for the field in 20, 30 years? Where are we going now?
I don't know for sure, obviously, but my team depends on external funding to keep going. And we try to keep ahead of the curve if we can. And where we're going right now has to do with the soft skills associated with human-machine interaction. Not about just the usability of an interface, but what happens to our decision-making when we're interacting with a machine. And again, you can see the results of that decision-making on the screen with translators. You can hear it with interpreters. So what's happening with emotions, what's happening with decision-making, are suggestions by machines priming us? We need to know about this for the future, because if they are, we need to get ahead of that and make sure that that's not the case.
Fantastic. That was very enlightening. Maureen, I had a great time talking to you. I'm sure the audience will.
Likewise.
And really, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you.